Calder, what are the established protocols at hospitals for marking a surgical site, and how often are those protocols not followed, which could lead to a wrong site surgery?
This happens surprisingly often, much more often than you would think. The site marking begins uh, at the pre-procedure verification. When the patient comes in, the surgeon sits down with the patient and goes over what procedure they're going to do to make sure that they have the right patient, that they're going to do at the right site, and they're going to do the correct procedure. That begins with verifying the patient's name, their date of birth, and that they have the correct medical record number. And when they're discussing the procedure, they're going to discuss where they're going to do that procedure. And then either the surgeon or a member of the surgical team will mark that site physically on the patient. And this needs to be done with something permanent, often a permanent marker. It cannot be something that is not permanent. It can't be tape. It can't be a tie. It can't be anything that'll move or be affected by the dressing for the surgery. And it also can't be vague. I know most people think of X. That's oftentimes not allowed at a hospital, because does that mean cut here? Does that mean don't cut this one? And so there are policies and procedures in place at every hospital as to how to go about marking the site and what are acceptable site markings. And the surgical team needs to make sure that they are aware of each hospital's policies and procedures and are following them.
What are some of the examples that you've seen, or heard about, in Ohio of wrong site surgery? What kinds of things are we talking about here?
Yeah, it can be the most obvious things, from cutting off the wrong leg or the wrong hand or the wrong finger, but it can also be sometimes more subtle things. We've had cases where they perform a procedure such as cutting a gland or um, addressing wounds just on the wrong, side of either, the same arm or the same leg or the same parts of the body that don't always have laterality, such as left or right. Even things as little as that are wrong site, because it's not the correct gland. It's not the correct side of the hand or side of the arm or leg.
My teenage daughter just learned how to drive, and she sometimes forgets left from right. Still, does that play a role in it at all? Where the doctor might say like, "Oh, okay, now just to be sure, are we doing the surgery on your left leg today?" And then the patient might go, "Yeah, that's right," but maybe make a mistake, and it's actually the right one or something like that. Is there a patient responsibility in a case like that too, or? What's sort of the issues between, like, how do you determine left from right when sometimes people can make a simple little mistake?
Sure. I mean, I hesitate to say it's a patient responsibility. It's a responsibility of effective communication of the whole surgery team between the patient, the doctor, and everyone else involved. And it's even harder than what you just said, because it's not just someone's left and right. Remember, is it the patient's left or the doctor's left? Which is it, stage left? Which left is it? And then not only that, it becomes a game of telephone from the patient to the doctor to the scrub to the circulating nurse. And you need to make sure that it's clear, both communicated verbally and documented effectively. Sometimes we've seen instances of poor documentation prior to the surgery being what caused the miscommunication in the operating room, and that the doctor was sloppy in the office visits as to whether it was the doctor's left or the patient's left. And so when they got in the operating room and the patient was already under anesthesia, they weren't sure whose left, which left it was.
Yeah, it creates confusion. Yeah, I could see where maybe the doctors need to like actually touch your body and say like, okay, I'm grabbing this leg here. Is this the one that we're doing the surgery on? Make it a little bit more clear than just saying left or right or something like that. In a wrong site surgery case, there's something that's called the timeout procedure. What is that, and how do failures in that procedure typically contribute to events like this?
Yes, so the timeout is right before the surgery, and it's very important. It needs to be before the patient is put under general anesthesia, because the patient is also a member of the timeout. And in the timeout, they once again verify the right patient name, the right date of birth, the right medical record number, the procedure they're going to perform, and where they're going to perform it. What happens is, first and foremost, you'll see people rushing. You'll see this say, well, we already did this out in the hallway. We don't need to do it again here. Or anesthesia puts the patient under before the rest of the team comes in the room. The patient's already under anesthesia and not part of the timeout. Or you just see them skip this altogether or rely on documentation that is either vague or sloppy or wrong. And all of those types of errors are what leads to a wrong site surgery.
Besides just the surgeon, what other members of the surgical team could share responsibility for ensuring the correct surgical site? And is it the doctors and those nurses or whatever? Is it their responsibility, or is it the hospital's responsibility overall?
Sure. So it's both. The surgical team is just that, a team, and they all have a responsibility to work together and communicate effectively. And that comes not just from each person doing their own job in the surgery, but also it comes from a responsibility to speak up if something's being done incorrectly or not being done at all and skipped. It's each team's member's responsibility to say something. And it also falls on the hospital. Did they have the proper policies and procedures in place? And did they actually implement those policies and procedures? Were the members of the surgical team oriented on them? There's a lot, we see a lot today. We see a lot of travel nurses. We see a lot of float pools of people floating to different parts of the hospital. Were they oriented on those policies and procedures? And were they trained? Were they retrained and held accountable if they're not followed?
How do other factors like time pressure and fatigue or distractions in the operating room contribute to wrong site procedures, and what measures can be taken to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, these are absolutely problems we see in today's operating rooms. And unfortunately, this is a reality that our medical professionals have to deal with the current situations in hospitals, which is that time and procedures are money. The more procedures these medical professionals can do, the faster they can do them, the more money the hospitals can make. And so they want the physicians to pack their schedules. They want to get as many procedures in as they can, and they want them to do as many as they can total throughout the year. And so there's these incentives to do more, to work longer shifts, and to bust out these procedures. And that's why you see a lot of these fatigues, a lot of these sloppy mistakes, a lot of rushing. It doesn't come from an indifference or a lack of empathy for the patient, but from the pressures put on these medical professionals by the hospitals.
You always hear on TV about doctors having 24-hour shifts, and then they're off for a couple of days, and then they're on for another 24 hours, and how it messes with their schedule and their sleep schedule, and how tired they can be. Are there any moves to change that kind of schedule for doctors? It seems crazy to me that I could be operated on by a doctor who's been awake for 22 hours.
I have not seen anything, specifically in writing. Hospitals will always say, we make sure that they're not overscheduled or overworked, but you don't see that in writing. You don't see that play out in the policies. And once you start digging into their schedules and the work they're actually doing and their office hours combined with the operating room, combined with being on call, you really get to see this whole picture of just how much work and how on the clock these medical professionals are.